On a crisp autumn morning, the streets of London were alive with activity. The air carried a slight chill, and golden leaves danced in the breeze as they fell from the trees lining the sidewalks. Tourists milled about, snapping photos of iconic landmarks, while locals hurried along, clutching coffee cups and briefcases. Among this bustling scene stood James Calloway, a man whose presence seemed both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. James was no stranger to life's challenges. At 68 years old, his face bore the marks of time, lines etched by laughter, sorrow, and countless untold stories. His silver hair was neatly combed, but it was the row of medals pinned to his chest that drew attention. Each medal told a story: battles fought, sacrifices made, and lives forever changed. Today, he wasn't just another visitor wandering through London. He had come here with purpose. Buckingham Palace loomed ahead, its grandeur undiminished by the passage of time. To many, it was simply a tourist attraction, a symbol of royalty and history. But to James, it meant something deeper. As a young soldier decades ago, he had sworn an oath to protect his country, standing shoulder to shoulder with comrades who gave everything for their nation. Now, standing before the palace gates, he felt a mix of emotions: pride, nostalgia, and even a tinge of sadness. So much had changed since those days, yet some things remained constant, like the silent dedication of the royal guards stationed outside. The guards stood tall and motionless, their red tunics and towering bearskin hats making them look almost larger than life. They moved only when necessary, embodying discipline and tradition. James watched them quietly, his mind drifting back to memories of parades and ceremonies where he once marched alongside fellow soldiers. Those moments now felt distant, like scenes from a movie he'd watched long ago. Yet there was something comforting about seeing these young men carry on the legacy of service. As James approached the gates, he noticed one guard in particular, a young man with sharp features and piercing eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. There was something about him that caught James's attention. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, exuding quiet strength despite being surrounded by noise and chaos. Or maybe it was the subtle flicker of curiosity in his gaze as he observed the crowd around him. Whatever it was, James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter might hold special meaning. For a moment, James hesitated. He knew what he wanted to do, but doubt crept in. Would anyone notice? Did it even matter anymore? Then, taking a deep breath, he reminded himself why he was here: to pay tribute, not just to the monarchy or the institution represented by the palace, but to the idea of service itself. With renewed resolve, he straightened his posture, adjusted his coat, and raised his trembling hand toward his forehead. What happened next would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. James's hand hovered briefly in the air before he completed the salute, his fingers pressed firmly against his forehead. It was a gesture steeped in tradition, discipline, and respect, a salute that carried the weight of years spent in service to his country. His eyes locked onto the young royal guard standing just a few feet away, their gazes meeting for the briefest of moments. For James, this wasn't just an act of courtesy, it was personal. He had seen too many friends march off to war never to return, had endured nights under starless skies, wondering if anyone back home remembered their sacrifices. This salute was his way of honoring them all. The young guard, whose nameplate read Reed, stood as still as a statue, adhering strictly to the rules drilled into him during training. Guards were taught never to react, no matter what happened around them. Whether it was tourists trying to distract them, children playing pranks, or even pigeons landing on their hats. But there was something different about this man in front of him. James's presence commanded attention, not because he demanded it, but because it radiated authenticity. Reed couldn't help but notice the rows of medals gleaming faintly in the morning light, each one a testament to bravery and sacrifice. As James held his salute, the crowd nearby began to take notice. A group of tourists paused mid-conversation, their cameras lowering slightly as they watched the scene unfold. Parents nudged their children, whispering explanations about what was happening. Some people exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a routine interaction or something more profound. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with anticipation. For James, the moment felt surreal. He could hear the distant hum of traffic and the chatter of voices fading into the background, leaving only the rhythmic beating of his own heart. His mind flashed back to his days in uniform, the camaraderie, the hardships, the unspoken bond shared by those who served together. Those memories came rushing back now, triggered by the sight of the young guard standing so proudly before him. In that instant, James didn't see Private Reed as just another soldier following orders. He saw a reflection of himself at a younger age, full of hope and determination, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But then something unexpected happened. As James lowered his hand slowly, the young guard's expression shifted ever so slightly. Reed's eyes softened, betraying the humanity beneath the rigid exterior. Though his body remained perfectly still, his gaze lingered on James, studying him with quiet admiration. It was as though he understood the depth of emotion behind the gesture, recognizing it not merely as protocol, but as a heartfelt tribute from one soldier to another. The crowd grew quieter, sensing that this exchange was unlike anything they'd seen before. People leaned in closer, trying to catch every detail. A woman clutched her scarf tightly around her neck, her eyes welling up with tears. An older man standing nearby removed his hat, holding it respectfully over his chest. Even the children, usually restless and loud, seemed captivated by the solemnity of the moment. What made this encounter so powerful wasn't just the salute itself. It was the unspoken connection between two individuals separated by decades yet united by a shared sense of duty. James had come here seeking closure, hoping to find some semblance of peace after a lifetime of carrying burdens most couldn't imagine. And in that fleeting moment, as the young guard met his gaze, he felt a glimmer of understanding pass between them. It was a reminder that though times may change, the values of honor, courage, and sacrifice remain timeless. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of what would become an unforgettable chapter in both their lives, and in the hearts of everyone fortunate enough to witness it. Private Thomas Reed stood frozen in place, his body rigid and his gaze unwavering as he had been trained to do. But inside, a storm of emotions was brewing. The young guard's mind raced with thoughts he hadn't expected to confront while on duty. He had always prided himself on his discipline, his ability to block out distractions and remain stoic no matter what unfolded around him. Yet, something about James Calloway, this elderly man with weathered hands and rows of medals glinting softly in the sunlight, was impossible to ignore. Reed's training told him to stay still, to maintain the composure expected of a royal guard. But his heart tugged at him, urging him to acknowledge the gesture that James had just made. The salute wasn't casual or perfunctory. It was deliberate, heartfelt, and loaded with meaning. It was a salute born out of years of service, sacrifice, and memories that weighed heavily on the soul. Reed could see it in James's eyes, the weight of battles fought, friends lost, and nights spent wondering if anyone remembered their efforts. For a moment, Reed wrestled with himself. Breaking protocol was unthinkable. Guards were not supposed to move unless absolutely necessary, let alone respond to gestures from civilians. But as he looked at James, standing there with quiet dignity, Reed realized this wasn't just any civilian. This was a veteran, a man who had once worn a uniform like his, who had faced dangers far greater than anything Reed would likely encounter during his own service. How could he stand there, unmoving, when such respect was being shown? The decision came quickly, almost instinctively. Reed shifted his weight ever so slightly, stepping forward just a fraction of an inch. His movements were subtle, calculated, and barely noticeable to anyone unfamiliar with the strict rules governing the guard's behavior. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like nothing more than a slight adjustment of posture. But those who understood the gravity of the situation gasped audibly. With precision and care, Reed raised his hand to his forehead, returning the salute. It was a perfect mirror of James's gesture, executed with the same level of respect and reverence. Time seemed to slow down as the two men locked eyes once again. The crowd, which had been murmuring quietly until now, fell into stunned silence. No one dared to speak, afraid to break the spell cast by this unexpected moment of connection. What made Reed's action even more remarkable was its rarity. The royal guards were symbols of tradition, bound by centuries of customs and expectations. They weren't meant to engage with the public beyond their ceremonial roles. For Reed to step outside those boundaries, even in such a small way, was extraordinary. It spoke volumes about the depth of his character and his willingness to prioritize humanity over protocol. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air grew palpable. People exchanged wide-eyed looks, unsure of how to process what they were seeing. Some reached for their phones, capturing the scene in photos or videos, while others simply stood transfixed, absorbing every detail. A young mother knelt beside her child, explaining softly why this moment mattered. "That man is a hero," she whispered, pointing to James. "And the guard knows it too." James, for his part, seemed equally moved. His lips parted slightly, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Tears glistened in the corners of his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly, unwilling to let them fall. He had come here seeking closure, but what he received instead was validation, a recognition of his sacrifices, and a reminder that his service had not been forgotten. When Reed finally lowered his hand, resuming his formal stance, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. It began tentatively, with a few scattered claps, but soon swelled into a thunderous ovation. Strangers hugged one another, overcome by the raw emotion of the moment. Even the other guards, standing nearby in perfect formation, seemed affected, though they dared not show it outwardly. This simple act of breaking protocol had transformed an ordinary morning into something extraordinary. What started as a quiet salute between two individuals had become a shared experience, uniting everyone present in a collective moment of gratitude and reflection. And as the applause echoed through the streets of London, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a story that would leave a lasting impact on all who witnessed it. As the applause from the crowd began to fade, an undeniable energy lingered in the air. The connection between James Calloway and Private Thomas Reed had transcended protocol, leaving everyone present with a sense of awe and wonder. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, allowing the world to witness something rare, a bond forged not through words, but through shared understanding and mutual respect. James stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected this. All he had wanted was to pay his respects, to honor the memories of those who couldn't be here today. But what he received in return was far greater than he could have imagined. As he looked at Private Reed, he saw more than just a young guard following orders. He saw a reflection of himself decades ago, full of promise, courage, and determination. It was a humbling realization, one that brought both pride and sorrow bubbling to the surface. Private Reed, too, was deeply moved. Though his face remained composed, his mind raced with thoughts about the man standing before him. What battles had James fought? What sacrifices had he made? And how many nights had he spent wondering if anyone truly understood what he'd been through? These questions weighed heavily on Reed, reminding him of the immense responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. In that instant, James wasn't just a stranger. He was a living testament to everything Reed aspired to embody: strength, resilience, and unwavering dedication. The crowd, now fully aware of the significance of the moment, began to gather closer. Some people whispered among themselves, while others simply stared in silence, their eyes darting between James and Reed. One woman, her voice trembling with emotion, finally broke the quiet. "Sir," she said softly, addressing James, "would you mind sharing your story with us?" At first, James hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention. His life's journey, the triumphs, the losses, The scars, both visible and invisible, was deeply personal. Yet there was something about the sincerity in the woman's voice that touched him. After a brief pause, he nodded slowly, signaling that he would speak. With a deep breath, James began to recount fragments of his past. He spoke of enlisting as a young man, driven by a desire to serve his country and protect the freedoms so many took for granted. He described the camaraderie he shared with his fellow soldiers, the unspoken brotherhood that formed in the trenches and on the front lines. His voice cracked slightly as he mentioned names, friends who had stood beside him, laughed with him, and ultimately given their lives for a cause greater than themselves. I remember one night, James continued, his gaze distant as if reliving the memory. We were huddled together under a sky filled with stars. None of us knew if we'd make it till morning, but we promised each other that no matter what happened, our sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Tears welled up in his eyes as he added, but when I came home, it felt like the world had moved on without us. Like no one remembered. His words hung heavy in the air, resonating deeply with everyone who listened. Parents held their children tighter, veterans exchanged knowing nods, and even strangers reached out to hold hands. It was as though James's story had opened a floodgate of emotions, reminding them all of the cost of peace and freedom. Private Reed listened intently, his expression softening further beneath his stoic exterior. Though he had only joined the military a few years ago, he understood the weight of the legacy he carried. Hearing James's account made him realize that the uniform he wore wasn't just a symbol of duty. It was a link to countless stories of bravery and sacrifice. When James finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause once again. This time, however, it wasn't just admiration they were expressing. It was gratitude. People approached James, shaking his hand, patting his shoulder, and thanking him for his service. Some even knelt before him, overcome with emotion. Through it all, Private Reed remained nearby, watching silently. Though he didn't join in the commotion, his presence was felt. Every glance he exchanged with James reinforced the unspoken connection they now shared, a bond that transcended age, rank, and experience. It was clear to everyone present that this encounter was more than just a chance meeting. It was a reminder of the enduring power of humanity and the ties that bind us all. The crowd around James and Private Reed had grown denser, a sea of faces drawn together by the magnetic pull of emotion. Strangers who moments ago were simply passing through the streets of London now stood shoulder to shoulder, their attention fixed on the elderly veteran. James's story had struck a chord deep within them, awakening feelings they didn't know they carried. His words weren't just about war or sacrifice. They were about humanity, resilience, and the quiet courage it takes to keep moving forward even when the world seems to have forgotten. As James spoke, his voice wavered at times, but it never faltered. He recounted tales of camaraderie, how soldiers would share jokes during the darkest hours, finding laughter in places where despair seemed inevitable. He described the haunting beauty of battlefields under moonlight and the unbearable silence that followed after gunfire ceased. Each word painted vivid images in the minds of those listening, transporting them to a time and place far removed from the bustling city around them. But it was when he spoke of loss that the atmosphere shifted. James paused, swallowing hard as if trying to steady himself. "I lost my best friend," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "His name was Daniel. We joined up together, trained together. And then one day, he was gone." He shook his head slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't forget someone like that. You carry them with you every single day." The weight of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers exchanged somber glances, and young couples held hands a little tighter. It wasn't just sympathy they felt, it was empathy. Many realized how easy it was to take peace for granted, to overlook the sacrifices made by men and women like James so that others could live without fear. One woman stepped forward, her cheeks streaked with tears. She knelt before James, placing a small bouquet of flowers she had been carrying at his feet. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking. For everything. Her gesture sparked a ripple effect. Others began laying flowers too. Roses, daisies, even sprigs of greenery plucked from nearby trees. Within minutes, a makeshift memorial had formed at the base of the palace gates, a tribute not only to James but to all who had served. Private Reed watched silently, his heart swelling with pride and humility. Though he remained in his post, his posture softened slightly, his rigid stance giving way to something more human. He thought about the oath he'd taken when he joined the military, to protect and serve with honor. Standing here now, witnessing the raw emotions pouring out of the crowd, he understood the true weight of that promise. It wasn't just about defending land or borders. It was about preserving the values that made life worth living: freedom, unity, and compassion. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Why are they crying?" The mother knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Because sometimes people do brave things that we can't imagine," she explained gently. "And these brave people remind us to be thankful." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching a tiny British flag in his hand. After a moment, he walked up to James and handed him the flag, offering a shy smile. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice clear and earnest. James accepted the flag with trembling hands, his throat tight with emotion. He looked at the boy, seeing in his wide eyes the future he and his comrades had fought to protect. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to swell, drawing in passers-by who couldn't help but stop and ask what was happening. When they heard James's story, they stayed, adding their voices to the chorus of gratitude. Some sang softly, patriotic songs that echoed off the palace walls. Others prayed quietly, bowing their heads in reverence. Even tourists who didn't speak English joined in, moved by the universal language of respect and remembrance. Through it all, James remained humble, almost overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and appreciation. He hadn't come here seeking recognition, yet he found himself surrounded by people eager to express their thanks. As he glanced at Private Reed once more, he saw the same mix of emotions reflected in the young guard's eyes: pride, sorrow, and an unspoken vow to carry the torch passed down by generations before him. This moment, born from a simple salute, had grown into something extraordinary, a shared experience that transcended individual lives and united strangers in a collective act of gratitude. And though the day would eventually end, the impact of this gathering would linger long after, etched into the hearts of everyone who bore witness. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had transformed into something almost otherworldly. The air buzzed with emotion, thick with gratitude and reflection, as if the very walls of the historic building were absorbing the weight of the moment. James Calloway stood at the center of it all, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. He hadn't anticipated this kind of response, this overwhelming wave of love and appreciation from complete strangers. Yet here he was, surrounded by people who seemed determined to ensure he knew his sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. Private Thomas Reed, still stationed near the gates, felt a lump form in his throat. Though he remained outwardly composed, his mind raced with thoughts about the scene unfolding before him. The flowers, the songs, the tears. It was more than just a tribute to James. It was a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. Reed couldn't help but think about his own role in this legacy. Would he one day stand where James stood, sharing stories of battles fought and friends lost? Or would peace prevail, sparing him from such heartache? Either way, he vowed silently to honor those who came before him, including the man standing just a few feet away. As the crowd continued to swell, an elderly woman pushed her way through, leaning heavily on a cane. Her eyes locked onto James, and she moved toward him with surprising determination. When she reached him, she took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "I remember you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Not you specifically, but men like you. My father served in the war too. He came home, but he was never the same." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her words raw and unfiltered. "Thank you for reminding me of him today." Her words struck a chord not only with James but with everyone listening. People nodded in agreement, their own memories surfacing. Grandparents, uncles, siblings, or parents who had served and returned changed, carrying invisible scars that no metal could heal. The shared pain and resilience bound them together, creating an unspoken understanding among strangers. Inspired by the woman's courage, others began stepping forward, each wanting to share a piece of their story. A middle-aged man recounted how his brother had been deployed overseas and never returned, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. A teenage girl spoke of her grandfather, who rarely talked about his time in the military, except to say he'd do it all over again if it meant protecting his family. Each story added another layer to the tapestry of remembrance, weaving together threads of loss, pride, and gratitude. Amid the heartfelt exchanges, Private Reed made a decision. Breaking protocol once again, he stepped fully out of formation, his boots clicking softly against the pavement. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached James, their eyes following his every move. For a moment, there was silence, a collective holding of breath, as everyone waited to see what he would do next. Reed extended his gloved hand toward James, his gesture simple yet profound. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but filled with reverence, "thank you for your service, and thank you for reminding us of what truly matters." James hesitated for only a second before reaching out and grasping Reed's hand firmly. Their handshake lingered, a powerful symbol of unity across generations. Around them, applause erupted once more, louder and more passionate than before. Strangers embraced, some sobbing openly, while others raised their fists in solidarity. The energy was electric, a palpable reminder of the strength found in coming together. Even the other guards, though bound by duty to remain stoic, couldn't hide the flicker of emotion in their eyes. They exchanged subtle glances, acknowledging the rarity of such a moment. It wasn't often that tradition gave way to humanity, but when it did, it left an indelible mark. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the scene, someone began singing "God Save the Queen." Others joined in, their voices blending harmoniously, despite differences in age, background, and nationality. The melody soared, filling the space between the palace gates and the gathered crowd, tying everyone together in a shared act of patriotism and remembrance. For James, this was more than closure, it was validation. He had carried the burden of his past alone for so long, believing that no one truly understood. But now, surrounded by strangers turned friends, he realized he wasn't alone. His sacrifices mattered. His story mattered. And as he looked around at the sea of faces, young and old, he felt a sense of peace wash over him, a peace he hadn't known in decades. This moment, born from a single salute, had become something far greater, a celebration of courage, unity, and the enduring power of human connection. As the final notes of "God Save the Queen" faded into the cool autumn air, the crowd lingered, unwilling to let the moment slip away. The connection between James Calloway and Private Thomas Reed had ignited something profound, a spark that spread through everyone present, binding them together in shared emotion. It wasn't just about honoring veterans or recognizing service. It was about humanity itself, the ability to see one another, to acknowledge pain and sacrifice, and to offer gratitude in return. Private Reed still stood beside James, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the bridge that had been built between generations. Though he had broken protocol twice now, neither he nor anyone else seemed concerned about rules anymore. This was bigger than tradition. It was about heart. As the applause softened into murmurs, Reed leaned slightly closer to James and said, "You've given us all something today, sir. Something we'll carry with us forever." James nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He didn't trust himself to speak just yet, so he simply placed a hand on Reed's shoulder, squeezing gently as if to say everything words couldn't capture. Around them, people began forming a circle, holding hands instinctively, creating a human chain that stretched from the palace gates deep into the crowd. Strangers linked arms, their differences erased by the shared realization that they were part of something greater than themselves. One woman, clutching her young daughter's hand, stepped forward and handed James a folded piece of paper. "For you," she said softly. "It's a letter my son wrote when he learned about soldiers like you in school. I think you should have it." James accepted the note with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully. Written in childish scrawl were the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe. You're my hero." The simplicity of the message struck James deeply. Heroes weren't supposed to cry, but he couldn't stop the tears from spilling down his cheeks this time. He looked at the boy standing shyly behind his mother, gave him a watery smile, and saluted once more, this time not as a soldier, but as a grateful man moved beyond measure. The act inspired others to share tokens of appreciation. A teenage girl pressed a handmade poppy pin into James's palm, explaining that she'd made it herself after learning about Remembrance Day. An older gentleman handed him a small photograph of a soldier, saying, "That's my brother. He never came home. But today, seeing you here, it feels like he's with us again." Each gift, no matter how small, carried immense meaning, reminding James that his life's journey had touched countless others in ways he might never fully understand. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow, drawing in passersby who couldn't resist stopping to witness the unfolding scene. Tourists paused mid-selfie, lowering their phones to listen. Shopkeepers emerged from nearby stores, curious about the commotion. Even traffic slowed as drivers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Word spread quickly, carried by social media posts and whispered conversations, until the entire area buzzed with energy. At one point, a group of musicians appeared, instruments in hand. Without prompting, they began playing a soft rendition of Amazing Grace. The haunting melody drifted through the crowd, wrapping around everyone like a warm embrace. People closed their eyes, swaying gently, letting the music wash over them. For those few minutes, nothing else mattered. The noise of the city faded, leaving only the harmony of voices and strings uniting hearts. Private Reed watched it all unfold, his chest swelling with pride and humility. He thought about the oath he'd taken, to serve and protect, and realized that protecting wasn't just about guarding buildings or borders. It was also about preserving moments like this, ensuring that stories of bravery and sacrifice were remembered and honored. As he glanced at James, he saw not just an aging veteran, but a living legacy, proof that courage could inspire even in silence. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, James turned to address the crowd one last time. His voice, though tired, carried strength. "I didn't come here expecting any of this," he admitted, gesturing to the sea of faces before him. "But I'm glad I did. Because today, I've seen something beautiful, something rare. I've seen people coming together, remembering and caring. And that gives me hope." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. Slowly, the circle of people began to disperse, but the impact of the day remained etched in their hearts. Flowers still adorned the base of the palace gates, a makeshift memorial that would remain long after the crowd had gone. Handshakes were exchanged, hugs were shared, and promises were made to carry the spirit of this moment forward. As James Calloway walked away from the gates of Buckingham Palace, the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter than it had been in decades. Each step he took felt steadier, as if the burden of unresolved memories and lingering doubts was slowly lifting. The encounter with Private Thomas Reed, and the overwhelming response from the crowd, had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: validation. For years, he had carried the scars of war, both visible and invisible, wondering if anyone truly understood what he and his comrades had sacrificed. But today, surrounded by strangers turned friends, he had found his answer. He mattered. His story mattered. Behind him, the makeshift memorial at the palace gates continued to grow. Flowers, handwritten notes, and small tokens of appreciation piled up, transforming the space into a vibrant tapestry of remembrance. A young couple added a framed photograph of their grandfather in uniform, while a child placed a toy soldier beside the blooms. Passers-by stopped to read the messages scrawled on scraps of paper. "Thank you for your bravery," one read. Another simply said, "We remember." It was as though the entire city had come together to honor not just James, but all who had served and sacrificed. Private Reed resumed his post, standing tall once more beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. Yet his demeanor had shifted subtly. His movements were still precise, his posture unwavering, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As he stood guard, his mind replayed the events of the day. The salute, the handshake, the stories shared by James and the crowd. He thought about the responsibility resting on his shoulders, not just to protect the monarchy or uphold tradition, but to carry forward the legacy of those who came before him. The ripple effect of the day's events extended far beyond the palace grounds. Social media buzzed with photos and videos of the heartfelt gathering, capturing moments that tugged at heartstrings across the globe. News outlets picked up the story, dubbing it the Day of Unity, and highlighting how a simple gesture between two men had sparked an outpouring of gratitude and reflection. Messages poured in from around the world, people sharing their own stories of loved ones who had served, expressing thanks to veterans they had never met, and pledging to keep the spirit of remembrance alive. For Private Reed, the experience became a turning point in his career. Though he remained committed to his duties as a Royal Guard, he began volunteering with veteran organizations during his off hours. He organized events to bring together current service members and retired veterans, fostering connections like the one he had shared with James. Every time he recounted the story of that autumn morning, his voice filled with pride, not for himself, but for the man who had reminded everyone of the power of human connection. James, meanwhile, returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. The letters and flowers left at the palace gates were collected and delivered to him later that week, filling his modest living room with reminders of the day's impact. He spent hours reading through the notes, each one bringing tears to his eyes. One message, written by a teenager, stood out. "You've inspired me to be braver, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Those words stayed with James, fueling his decision to visit schools and community centers to share his story. He wanted to ensure that future generations understood the cost of peace and the importance of remembering those who fought for it. Months later, a plaque was installed near the palace gates commemorating the day's events. Etched into the stone were the words, "In memory of all who have served, and in gratitude to those who continue to inspire us." On its unveiling day, James stood beside Private Reed once again, this time joined by hundreds of people eager to pay tribute. As they saluted the plaque together, the moment felt symbolic, a bridge spanning generations, binding past and present in mutual respect. Though their paths diverged after that day, James and Reed remained connected by the unspoken bond they had formed. They exchanged occasional letters, updating each other on their lives and work. In one letter, Reed wrote, "That day changed me, sir. It reminded me why I wear this uniform, and whose footsteps I'm following. Thank you for showing me what true courage looks like." James replied simply, "Thank you for reminding me that we're never alone." And so, the story of a war veteran and a Royal Guard became more than just a fleeting moment. It became a legacy. It reminded everyone who heard it that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can create ripples of change. That gratitude has the power to heal wounds and unite hearts, and that even in a fast-paced world, often focused on the next big thing, taking a moment to pause, reflect, and honor